Welcome back to the Modern Mystic, where we fall asleep inside the quiet lives of history's greatest minds. Tonight, we slip into the early mornings of Frida Kahlo, inside La Casa Azul, to move slowly and notice how she simply began her days. What if genius lives in how someone pours their tea? What if peace doesn't come from achievement, but from steady repetition? What if becoming yourself means quietly returning, morning after morning, with no audience at all? This isn't a story, it's a slow remembrance. Every moment is gathered gently from real life and told as the hush of morning light. If you have ever needed quiet, if you felt lost or uncertain, if mornings sometimes feel heavy or hollow, this gentle walk with Frida may help you feel less alone. Just let yourself relax. There's no need to stay awake or even finish. Trust that what's meant for you will reach you, even as you drift. No need to focus. Just let yourself soften. Let the details float around you, and let Frida's world open, one slow breath at a time. The earliest morning over Coyocan comes in quiet blue, before the world stirs, before voices echo against the whitewashed walls of the barrio. In this quiet, a child is born. Magdalena Carmen Frida Kahlo, why Calderon enters the world in the family home on Lander Street, later known as La Casa Azul, the house with walls painted an unapologetic cobalt, as if determined to hold color against the dusty, sun-baked landscape. Even in those earliest years, the heavy wooden doors of the house closed gently with a familiar sigh. Sheets of sunlight move slowly across the tiled floors. The smell of earth and chilies from the market drifts in through open windows, mingling with the quieter scent of old paper and wood polished by generations of hands. In Frida's earliest memories, there is a rhythm to the day that is set by the house itself, the creak of floorboards, the brush of linen skirts, the chatter of sparrows who nest beneath the tiled roof. She grows in these rooms, small feet slipping over patterned clay tile. The mornings are never hurried, always suspended, as if the sun comes up more gently in this place. Her father, Guillermo, a photographer by trade, places his heavy cameras on the work table in the soft shade. Light glints off the glass viewfinders and settles into his beard. The click of a metal clasp, the smell of developing chemicals, peppermint oil lingering at the collar of his shirt. These are steady presences. Frida sits quietly, tracing her fingers over the grain of the wooden table. The patience required to fix an image to a plate is absorbed into her own body, teaching her that even stillness can create lasting things. The garden outside is bordered by volcanic stone, black and cool beneath her touch. It is filled with plantain leaves and dahlias, lush, living things surrounded by the songs of crickets. She learns the shape of leaves, how the light falls in dappled patches, how dew quietly disappears as the day grows warmer. The world beyond the blue walls is unpredictable, but in this garden and house, the colors and the soil, there is a calm that slows time. Her mother, Matilda, moves through the home in quiet authority. The rustle of her long skirts marks the passage of each morning, her presence measured by the scent of fresh tortillas, stewing beans, and rose water for the altar. Every surface carries her touch, the embroidered cloth on the kitchen table, the earthenware jugs cooling water for the day. School books are stacked on the family desk, their pages marked by careful handwriting. Frida's small hands linger over paper, tracing letters, repeating lessons. Some days the pages carry the faintest scent of ink and the dust of the street. Other days she watches clouds drift past iron window grates, a reminder that life inside Casa Azul, though protected, is not separated from the larger world of Mexico City, only a short journey away. There is an awareness, almost unspoken, that life will test its boundaries. Illness and unrest sometimes spill through the blue gates, as they did in 1913, when a sudden fever left Frida bedridden for months, her body altered by polio, but her spirit folded inward, learning the intricacies of resilience in isolation. Her bed, carved and sturdy, becomes an island. She learns patience with pain, the slow passage of days measured by shadows crawling over lime-washed ceilings. This household, always slowly awake, holds threads of suffering and care in equal measure. People move with a softness that comes from knowing the world can change in an hour, but for now is contained by the familiar rhythm of the place, the simple acts of washing, kneading, reading, mending. This rhythm is not forced or rushed. It is simply present like the blue walls themselves, sturdy, worn, impassably vibrant after every rain. To be born here is to be shaped by quiet forces. Each morning, Frida draws from this ordinary steadiness, a steadiness that teaches rebellion can start with making the bed, that devotion might look like preparing tea before sunrise. Even in youth, she learns that greatness, if it ever arrives, will do so in very small, deliberate moments, just as color gathers in the sky at dawn, imperceptible until the whole world is quietly changed. In the dim light of morning, sounds drifted through the windows of La Casa Azul, distant calls of street vendors, the shuffle of footsteps on tiled floors. Frida was still a child then, her small feet bare and quiet against cool stone. The walls around her were cobalt blue, saturated and cool to the touch, their texture faintly rough beneath her fingertips. She liked to press her palm flat against that wall, feeling the steadiness of it, the way it didn't move no matter how the world outside shifted. On mornings like these, her mother would be at the kitchen table, wrapped in a rebozo. The air always seemed to smell faintly of something soft, warm tortillas, steeping herbs, a hint of orange peel. Sometimes light slipped into the kitchen in thin lines, catching in the worn wood of the tabletop. Frida would stand quietly at the doorway, listening for a long moment before crossing the threshold. Her mother's movements were patient and methodical, folding and refolding a piece of linen, not to hurry, but as if the repetition itself meant something. In those early years, the days felt slow and heavy and sacred, measured not by clocks, but by sunlight and the rhythm of life in the old house. Outside, a fig tree pressed up against the window, its leaves brushing against the glass in soft rhythm. Frida would trace the veins on a fallen fig leaf with a careful thumb, the delicate green calling her back to the simplicity of being small, being new. Her father, Guillermo, would often be found in the other room, hunched over a camera or writing by lamplight. His devotion to detail, to the ordered world of photographs and architecture, was quiet and whole. Frida watched him frame each shot, line up edges with care, adjust the camera's brass with steady hands. Sometimes he would let her hold the lens cap, cold, metallic, smooth. She felt the weight of it as if it were a secret past to her alone. The furniture stood simply, unadorned, scraped here and there from years of use. Chairs creaked, floorboards groaned gently, but nothing ever seemed out of place. Mornings never rushed. There was nobody to impress. The world had not yet become urgent. The work of the family was done in measured steps, every day much like the one before. Frida's spirit rooted in these ordinary hours. She learned that the soul grows not just in joy, but through small steadiness, the way a tree's roots expand beneath stone, long before new leaves appear overhead. Some mornings she simply listened to her own breath, the sound blending with the faint calls of the city, the slow creak of the house, the warm exhalation of the kitchen fire. Here she had not yet learned of fame or pain, just the gentle awareness that life was something unfolding slowly, right in the center of her family's home. The world beyond those gates was noisy, unpredictable. But inside, within the blue walls, the ancient rhythm held her. Childhood did not ask, it simply offered. Every sense was awakened by the ordinary. The feel of earthenware in her hands, cool water splashed onto her face, the weave of her cotton dress around her knees. These were her first prayers, spoken silently in the language of attention. Before rituals, before paintings, before the world arrived, Frida's soul was learning the art of presence, just being, in the constant company of morning light and the trusted echo of familiar voices. The spirit knows its depth, even in the simplest hour, and it remembers the roots it never saw but always felt underneath. In the soft blue light of morning, La Casa Azul is still. The wooden floors creak as Frida moves down the corridor, her slippers muffled against painted tile. The air carries the faint trace of yesterday's rain, mingling with the sharper scent of coffee from the kitchen. Among these early shadows, family portraits line the walls, surfaces glossy and aging quietly, holding memory more than display. Her father's image is always near the entry, Wilhelm, with a gaze that seems both stern and gentle. His camera, sometimes left on a side table, is polished and heavy, cold to the touch. Frida often rests her fingers on its brass fittings, remembering how he would instruct her to sit still for the lens. Later, she would write how she inherited his serious eyes and his way of noticing small details, the seam on a napkin, the reflection in a puddle, the knotted grain in the ancient trees outside. A German orderliness exists in the set of his books, stacked end to end, each volume marked with neat script. It remains even in the way breakfast is arranged. The bread sliced precisely, fruit fanned on blue and white dishes, the silver Turkish coffee part warm in his hands. On the far side of the first courtyard, sunlight filtered through broad fig leaves, landing in small golden squares across Frida's bedroom floor, near the old wood frame of the bed. The scent of waxed floors mingled with distant coffee. These were the mornings when her father, Guillermo Kahlo, would sit at his desk, carefully adjusting clerks, organizing negatives, lining up pens until everything felt quietly in order, his presence a modest anchor in the house, grounding the collective undertone with his steady, methodical hands. Frida's mother moved with a gentler authority, her skirt always brushing against the hand-laundered linen tablecloth, her voice soft but constant as the morning bell. Each person in the house occupied space with distinct rhythms. Sometimes, Frida lay still between waking and rising, listening for her mother's footsteps in the kitchen or the sound of her father's deliberate cough just outside her door. These early hours were shaped by the consistency of touch, her father's warm palm placed on her forehead when she battled illness, or her mother's careful fingers weaving thick auburn hair into long braids, each strand wound as tightly as hope, the feeling of her mother's hands, familiar as the carved wooden rosary on the dresser, traveled with Frida into adulthood, anchoring her body even when her spirit drifted far from comfort. Pale blue walls echoed with family stories. Sometimes her sisters would pass by, their laughter quiet as the slip of slippers across tiled hallways. For Frida, these echoes stitched together what she was and what lingered inside. The warmth, the worry, sometimes the space between parents held silence, a tension that never fully settled. She noticed how her father's silences were different than her mother's, noticing, too, a mirror inside herself, a place where quiet withheld comfort or was the comfort. Each morning, the ritual of gathering at the old wooden table marked an invisible line between her family and the world outside. Plates clicked softly, coffee poured in slow arcs, everyone present but not always together. The subtle spaces between words and glances became an early reminder that duality lives in every home, tenderness beside distance, love resting next to misunderstanding, as surely as the sugar bowl beside the warm bread basket. As within, so without, the young Frida sensed how the outer arrangement of family, order, repetition, even the brief tolerant absences, mimicked the movements inside her own heart. She learned quietly to live with contradiction, to find unity within duality, learning that belovedness never required perfection. Sometimes, sitting alone by the cobalt window, Frida felt as if she contained all the currents of her family: longing, devotion, the ache of separateness, the comfort of returning. Her first understanding of self came not from achievement, but the ordinary, slow unfolding of each quiet morning at La Casa Azul. The window glass in Coyocan was always slightly cool before noon. Inside her family's home, before the blue walls belonged to history, Frida was still just a girl. She would rest her hands on the wood of the windowsill, feeling the smooth grain as she watched children pass outside, their shoes sending soft puffs of dust into the morning air. It was 1913. Sometimes her breath left a subtle fog on the glass. She would trace it with her fingers, each line fading as the warmth of her skin met the chill. That year, childhood changed. Her legs felt heavy. There was pain at the knee and a slow fever. The doctor came, his leather bag clicking open on kitchen tile, the smell of antiseptic mixing with the leafy scent from the courtyard. He carried the diagnosis quietly, his voice not much louder than the creak of a chair. Polio, he said. There would be more rest, less classroom, more cotton sheets. For months, Frida watched the patterns on the ceiling above her bed. The linen was rough at first, softening only after many washings and the gentle touch of her mother's hands. Each day blurred not with commotion, but with the quiet repetition of healing baths and silent afternoons. Shadows drifted across the blue ceiling. The world outside continued without her. Her right leg grew thinner. She tucked it beneath her when guests arrived, preferring to keep it hidden under folds of muslin. There was a daily regimen, a ritual in its own way, her father helping her to walk, step by slow step, over kitchen tiles that were cool in the dawn. The cane he gave her was smooth and light. Each morning before the household stirred, he would lace up her boot and guide her toward the small garden. The stone path felt uneven beneath her soles. She noticed every shift. She felt the sun's warmth on her skin, though sometimes her body ached too much to linger. Some days brought a loneliness heavier than her own limbs. The sound of the city was distant, just a bird call now and again, or the distant clatter of something dropped in another room. She grew used to this hush, to the quiet that comes before others wake. Withdrawing supplies on her lap, Frida would try to capture what she could see from her window. She sketched rooftops, leaves, and her own hand. The texture of the paper was a comfort, the slight drag of pencil, the answering line. These were the hours when her longing was sharpest, to walk easily, to run, but also to be seen, not as fragile, but as someone newly awake to both beauty and pain. As weeks became months, her childhood took on a slower pulse. She grew attentive to the changing light in each room, the weight of sheets, the ritual sound of water poured into a basin. There was an ache, yes, but also a new patience. Observing her own healing, she learned the rhythm of stillness, how the body speaks when nothing else can. In these mornings, half awake and half remembering, Frida found the edge of solitude. It would become an old companion. Through window glass and cotton blankets, boredom became quiet devotion, longing into self-regard. She lingered there, as sunrise crept across her walls, marking the start of another day spent waiting yet belonging to herself, to silence, to the softness of survival. The blue of the morning walls grows denser in the stillness, as if each shade of La Casa Azul holds its own small ache. Frida's palm rests on the worn wood of the dressing table. The smooth surface, cool to the touch, is a reminder of all that her hands cannot fix. There is a slowness to this hour, an unhurried permission to linger with the pulse of longing that sits beneath her ribs. She sits, the cotton robe resting heavy on her shoulders, weighty where the day will demand lightness. Each breath seems to move through space thick with old incense and the faint memory of liniment, a place where pain is not just endured, but witnessed. The ache in her body pools quietly in her lower back, alive but not urgent. She does not turn away. She lets the discomfort unfold with the rhythm of her own inhale, exhale, as dawn waits just beyond the blue-framed window. Outside, the garden softens with dew. Frida's gaze lands on a terracotta pot holding spider plants, leaves tipped with brown, reaching for sun even before it fully arrives. The ache inside her answers to the reaching. For years, pain has been her closest companion. She no longer fights it as a mistake or an enemy. Instead, she greets it as part of the morning, brief, present. It is not her, but it is with her, a simple agreement between body and mind. She runs her hand over the embroidered skirt that waits on the bed, tracing each thread, each color sewn long ago. Pain, she knows, asks for slowness. It demands presence, and in presence she finds a different kind of clarity. There are teachings hidden inside the ache, an invitation to center her spirit when her body wavers. Some mornings the longing rises as silent tears down her cheek, warm and unnoticed, except by the pillow's carton. Solitude sharpens itself in the ritual here. The house is quiet, the city's sounds not yet rising. Kahlo's solitude is not absence, it is a sharpening, a peeling away of surface noise. In stillness she reaches for meaning, not answers. Suffering becomes a soft lamp, illuminating corners of herself that the day will later hide. There is no battle, only breathing, looking, touching linen or mug or braid, sitting with the way pain turns ordinary movement into ceremony. She thinks sometimes of the teachings whispered through the years, that pain can sometimes be a sign of misalignment, a call to return. She does not try to fix or analyze it. She lets it be. Solitude is the room that pain decorates, but also the room where spirit can sit and listen. A bird calls outside, faint against the thickening air. Frida pours tea. The steam rises like a gentle veil, blurring the edge between form and emptiness. Her hand, the cup, the moment itself. Nothing to fix, nothing to change. Just presence. She returns to her seat, the wood beneath grounding her in truth. In this quiet preamble to the day, pain and longing are not punishments, they are companions. Here, solitude shapes her soul, not in grand gestures, but in returning again to these small, sacred mornings. Over and over, the artist forged before her hands ever lift a brush. There is the slow memory of metal and glass, the morning that began with the weight of schoolbooks and laughter, ending quietly on the wooden benches of a city bus. Even now, if you were to walk across the stone streets outside La Casa Azul, you might hear the regular clatter of a bus passing by. Nothing special, just the pulse of a city in motion. But that day in 1925, the gentle rhythm was broken. The dull morning sun touched the window panes, making the world glow and blur. Frida sat by a window, skirt brushing her knees, tracing the outline of the street with her gaze. In her lap, ticket stubs curled, soft as petals, collected as a kind of proof that life moved predictably forward. There was the scent of pressed linen from her school uniform, and the faint, oily tang of machinery beneath the wooden boards of the vehicle. The people around her shifted weight, arms brushing against satchels and straps. She exhaled, feeling the old bus rattle, a strange comfort, until silence was taken by the crash. Eyewitnesses remembered the sound, the splintering of glass, the chaos of metal. Frida's hand, outstretched, met nothing but empty air. The gold handrail, so ordinary, became the marker of an ordinary life divided. Time splintered like the bus itself, scattering moments and objects on the street. Her body was caught under the memory of all these things. Dust, blood, the faded red of a scarf caught on the curb. There was no dramatic transformation, not then. Only the coldness of the ground, the pressure of stone and sandal. Someone's coat was placed over her shoulders. Someone's voice sounded distant, low, like it was coming through water. The air held the iron taste of pain. She stared up through city haze as one shoe slipped off, as if the world had permission to come undone, detail by detail, breath by breath. Morning blurred into afternoon. She was carried to a hospital, the walls white and peeling, smelling faintly of antiseptic and paper. A clean sheet was drawn over her, cool against her skin. Frida counted ceiling tiles, her breath shallow. Somewhere, a nurse wrote her name in block letters on a patient chart, ink gently bleeding into cheap paper. This was not grief, not yet. Just the slow work of survival, doctors, needles, splints, the settling in of bone and story. She kept her eyes open for each small act. A cup of water lifted to her lips, the soft heaviness of pillows rearranged. Outside, leaves moved against the hospital window, making vague shadows on the wall. Even time seemed reluctant to move quickly. In nights heavy with pain, she would listen to the hum of distant traffic, to the murmur of nurses in the hallway, to the fragile scrape of her own breathing. Sometimes she tried to remember the shape of the stoop outside La Casa Azul and the way morning light found its way through cobalt blue walls. Pain did not come all at once, it settled in layers. Bone, then muscle, then flesh. But so did the memory of beauty, someone bringing her a single flower, the petal bright against her hospital sheets. It was not comfort, but it was proof she still lived. Every morning before the dawn, she would shift slightly in bed, just enough to remind herself she could still move. Recovery did not mean returning to what was. It meant learning how to stay awake, how to endure the hours that unfolded, as slow and plain as an untouched canvas. The chair in Frida's bedroom is worn where she sat every morning, waiting quietly for her body to catch up with her mind. The painted red of the backrest had faded to soft orange in spots, a testament to how seasons changed while she stayed mostly still. There was a time when even breathing felt like an act of will. After another surgery, the heavy bandage on her back pressed up against the cane seat, and the light from her bedroom window felt distant, filtered, a pale echo of braver mornings. The world outside continued, uncertain of the pauses taking shape indoors. Her brush sat idle in a jar. Diego's voice echoed from elsewhere in the house, but Frida did not move to greet him. Some mornings her pain grew so loud that plans vanished. Failure was not an event. It was the emptiness in the hours that slipped through her fingers, the damp weight at her temples, the way linen sheets bunched under her restless knees. What now? Alone, she would silently name each pain, as if acknowledging them would lessen their claim. Warm light spilled over the blanket at her feet, and outside, a bird made a call. She simply listened. In these quiet failures, the mornings when neither color nor hope seemed available, time stretched. There is no drama here, only the room, the wood, the cool tiles under a careful foot if she managed to rise. Another morning lost, she thought, but there it was, an emptiness that waited, holding space for something unseen. When everything you counted on is stripped away, when strength or inspiration no longer obey, there is only the act of being, the slow return to breath, a battered cup of tea resting on a chipped saucer. Simple, silent, sacred. Again and again she learned that before new light, there was always this deep dusk, the gap between the old endurance and what would come next. A breakdown in plans, a breakdown of the body. Pausing on the edge of self-pity, she'd sometimes remember. It is exactly in the undoing, the small surrender, that something opens and waits. The cloth of her skirt, rough against her skin, reminded her she was still here, a pulse beneath endless limitations. Outside, leaves rattled lightly in the wind, speaking without words. She listened, because in listening, she accepted her place on a path where breakdown does not mean the story ends. Frida's mornings in Casa Azul were rarely triumphant. They were instead a cycle of letting go, letting the deepest part of herself recalibrate to loss, and then, at times, finding a different kind of strength blooming in the fissures, not with force, but with acceptance, not through glory, but through the sacred repetition of simply being. Each breakdown was not an ending, but a slow, unseen preparation for the return of color. She knew deeply that the truest shifts were quiet. The morning would wait out her pain. The chair would steady her while the world rearranged itself. In the spiritual rhythm of her life, failure and breakdown were not punishments or signs of absence. They were necessary. Breaking a little more, only to find there was always something, some faint current, some assumption of life, that would rise to carry her into becoming once more. The light in La Casa Azul settles gently against the rough white linen at the edge of Frida's bed. Each morning begins with the sound of fabric shifting, her cotton sheet pressed to her palm, the coolness of the pillow fading with her breath. The small bedroom is quiet except for the faint hum of the city waking up outside, a distant cart, a bicycle wheel against stone, the creak of old wood beneath her floor. Here, in this pool of blue walls, every detail waits. Unrushed, Frida sits upright, letting her eyes adjust to the texture of day. She reaches for her tea, always something strong and fragrant, steam drifting upward to blur the window glass. The cup is heavy in her hand, painted with age, the ceramic warming slowly. She inhales first, letting the herbs settle in her chest before each sip. It is not just tea, it is the beginning of silence, a pause held between the world and her own heartbeat. Her mornings stretch out, slow as honey. There is no rush in these first minutes, only the hush of her breathing and the sense of being gathered together, spine and spirit. She studies the worn surfaces in her room, the polished dresser, the mirror bordered by ribbons. She reaches for her brushes, not for painting yet, but for taming her dark hair into its daily crown. Each strand is smoothed back with care, her hands moving as if repeating a memory, not a task. On the bed, her clothes wait, layers of embroidered cotton and lace, skirts arranged by color, a blouse quiet but sturdy. Choosing what to wear is a ritual, not a performance. She lifts a piece of fabric to her cheek, letting the cool cotton anchor her to the present. Everything she selects feels heavier in the early hour. Each earring, each braid, each swatch of woven cloth. Some mornings she gazes at the wardrobe's open doors, lined with patterns and color. The Tehuana attire offers more than warmth or beauty. It is a kind of shelter, a deliberate construction of self before the mirror's slow gaze. The act of dressing is a meditation, button by button, scarf by scarf. The weight of the skirt, the brush of fabric against scarred skin, the quiet discipline of repetition. There are always the hidden stitches. She notices the places a hem has been mended, the texture of an old shawl fraying at its edges. Each repair is left visible, a sign that care takes time and that beauty can live alongside imperfection. Her fingers pause at the familiar place where a waistband once tore. She remembers mending it alone, by the window. The movement of needle through fabric, sunlight on her knees. She allows herself to linger, suspended between sleep and day. The act of dressing, layering, smoothing, tightening, arranging, becomes a way to return to her body, to recognize herself after the strange journey of the night. She feels the difference each morning. Sometimes her body aches, sometimes her spirit is weary, but the rhythm does not change. The tea, the quiet, the ritual of Tehuana cloth. It is an ordinary practice, but one that shields her as the morning drifts forward. The blue walls reflect a softness back to her, letting her remain hidden for a few moments more. In these habits, Frida is not yet an artist for the world. She is simply herself, wrapped in fabric and memory, listening to the slow unfolding of light. Frida's mornings inside La Casa Azul rarely changed in sequence, yet each movement was a chance to meet herself again. The clay mug, hand-painted and cool to touch, waited for the heat of water and leaves. Steam curled upward, touching her nose, signaling presence. Her palms, marked by age and experience, gripped the handle just so. Each sip was less about flavor and more about arrival, her body still, her attention gathering itself after the long drift of sleep. By the blue window, hints of garden color pressed against glass. Birds called through the thick morning air. As she layered fabrics, the slow routine was a kind of setting, a preparation of her vessel for the day. Frida's shawl, folded on the wooden bench overnight, was always lifted with both hands, its woven threads heavier than they looked. She let the cloth rest across her shoulders for several breaths before tying any knot. Repetition was not mechanical, not dismissive. Each act, a button guided through a loop, a metal clasp sliding together at the nape of her neck, became an invitation to remember. I am here. I am whole enough for this morning. It wasn't about perfection or novelty. A favorite pair of earrings, silver, cold at first, then warm against her cheek, anchored her senses in the now. She did not rush. The mirror's reflection was familiar, unapologetic. Frida checked nothing twice. She trusted the rhythm that had formed by her own hands over countless mornings. There, ritual turned into sanctuary. Even pain, persistent as ever in her back and legs, was simply greeted, not battled. In spiritual quiet, one returns, again and again, to the vessel. The habit, carried out with dignity, built a structure inside her that could hold joy and ache at once. Her rituals were less about the end result and more about the presence each step called forth. As the day waited beyond the garden gate, she stayed patient in these beginnings, knowing that routine, honored sincerely, drew in a subtle brightness. The outer blue walls held her steady. Practice and repetition made space for her spirit to enter softly and completely before the world could ask anything of her. And so, every morning, through fabric and tea, through small gestures and slow time, Frida reclaimed herself. She met her life not in grand gestures, but in the simplest, warmest returns. No striving, only arrival, configured with care. The first light drifted softly into the courtyard, glancing off the cobalt walls and stirring the shadows underneath the leafy limbs. Frida's mornings usually began before any visitor entered through the turquoise gates. Still in her plain morning slip, she would step outside, the stone floor cool beneath bare feet that ached from old pain. The chill of the surface greeted her, and she pressed her toes down, grounding herself before the sun warmed the stones. She moved among pots and hanging baskets, succulents with rounded leaves, ferns growing heavy, the gentle reach of bougainvillea along the edge of the house. As her hand brushed a velvet leaf, she lingered, feeling its softness, its quiet resilience. Sometimes the leaves bore the imprint of last night's rain, and she would turn them gently, tending to any dropped petal, adjusting a stem inside its cracked, painted part. In solitude, these small acts became her silent prayers. A clay bowl cradled cool water from the well. Frida would dip her fingers in, glancing at her reflection blurred by ripples, the lines of her jaw, her dark brows, the shadows beneath her eyes from another restless night. She washed dust from the leaves with careful swipes, moving slowly so the smallest seedlings stayed rooted. The ritual felt less like gardening and more like noticing, offering every plant a quiet acknowledgement that neither beauty nor struggle were ever wasted. From a low branch, the monkeys watched her, followers, not pets. They moved with languid curiosity, tails looping gently. Frida would sometimes whisper little nothings, words lost in the garden air. A palm extended, she'd let a monkey step across, its hand clutching hers, small nails pricking but never breaking skin. Esta mañana, mi ama tranquila, her voice nearly lost to the rustle of leaves and the distant ticking of the kitchen clock. The small animal blinked, unhurried, content just to linger in the morning alongside her, two souls connected by ritual and quiet company. Inside, a wooden writing desk stood far from sunlight, a cool sanctuary for private thoughts. Letters were scattered there, written in looping, hurried script, addresses never finished, envelopes left unsealed. They were missives to friends, family, even old selves. Sometimes Frida lifted a page, running her thumb along its edge. The paper was slightly wrinkled, smelling faintly of patchouli. She sometimes dabbed onto her wrists. She would reread fragments, never quite able to send them, but never willing to discard them either. Each one an act of remembering. each one a recognition of solitude stitched carefully into her life. There were no visitors yet, only the world just as it was, teeming, imperfect, and quietly holy in its waiting. Rooted in every slow movement was a reverence that grew, not in spectacle, but in repetition. And in this hour, Frida's devotion, tending leaf, whispering to monkey, caressing old paper, became as important as paint or canvas ever would. Soon the sun would rise higher, shadows shrinking along the tiles. But for a little while longer, there was only the slow comfort of a hidden rhythm. Beneath the painted cobalt walls, with the floor's morning chill pressing softly through the soles of her slippers, Frida carried out her quiet, private devotions, not in grand gestures, nor in ways meant to be seen, but through the smallest, almost invisible offerings. Sometimes it was only the slow dusting of a handmade figurine on her altar, or the gentle placement of a new marigold beside the others wilting in their clay bowl. The quiet was a vessel, thin sunlight skimming the tiles, fingers finding patterns in cotton cloth, a slow sip of bittersweet tea grown earthy overnight. Each movement, almost unremarkable, joined into a silent liturgy she rarely spoke aloud. There was no audience for these beginnings. Her hands often trembled from pain or fatigue, but she folded a napkin as if it mattered, a soft press of creased linen, the delicate balance between clean and used. In the silence broken only by a distant bird or the click of a neighbor's gate, she traced her brush across the inner curve of a mug or arranged the salt bowl just so. These were not tasks, but quiet acts of devotion, performed in the company of morning air, as the world outside her blue window remained still. Hidden work is sacred. The slow tidying of an old tray, the turning of a silver spoon, the smoothing of a worn embroidered cloth, each small effort was a thread woven into something greater than herself. Nothing was wasted, not even the moments when her breath grew shallow and she paused, allowing the sound of her own heart to fill the room. Somehow, the ordinary tasks, so easily overlooked, formed a tapestry of belonging. No need for praise, no spotlight, just the inner certainty that these gestures, though unseen, were known fully by the silence that held them. Frida listened for what could not be measured. In the stillness, she found the same quiet presence she sensed in her garden among the succulents, or in the steam lifting gently from her tea. It was here, in the hidden work, that devotion was strongest, a faith built not on what could be finished or admired, but on showing up quietly each day. The humility of this rhythm, offering effort without needing applause, became an anchor for her soul, like the parables told long ago of seeds sown in secrecy or lamps burning where none could see. Frida's mornings were laced with hidden prayers. She did not name them as such. Yet in the ordinary, her spirit drew near to the divine, a deep listening that needed no words or witness. These unseen acts, repeated in the privacy of her own sanctuary, reminded her that quiet love builds the strongest home. No color could compare. No canvas could fully hold what was offered behind closed doors, under soft light, with the heart as overseer. And so she moved through her rituals, letting small devotions become the ground on which she stood, ready for another day to begin. Some mornings inside La Casa Azul, the light came sooner, clearer, streaking quietly through the garden's green shadows and dappling onto the cool tiles of Frida's small studio. Frida would wake not with the world's rush, but with a deep pull, an urge that was neither habit nor routine, but a need rising inside her bones. On these rare days, paint cold before breakfast. The floor in her workspace was always a little cold this early. Frida would cross it slowly, her slippers barely making a sound as she passed by the tables lined with sketches and brushes still left unwashed from the night before. The air held the faint smells of turpentine, dried coffee, crushed leaves from the courtyard. Her hand would drift over the rough edge of her wooden work table, settling in the familiar groove worn smooth by years of movement, years of repetition. A tall mirror stood at one end of the studio, angled to catch the soft cobalt of morning. She moved toward it, slowly, pausing to brush dust off its surface with her wrist. She faced herself unadorned, eyes holding both fire and exhaustion. On some mornings, the pain in her back would pulse persistently, warm like a stone tucked under the blanket of her skin. But today, obsession steadied her hands. She pulled her heavy shawl tighter, drawing its warm threads up near her chin as she regarded her own reflection, steady and calm. At her work stool, a narrow, upright seat padded with worn fabric, she would set aside the stray scraps of muslin and half-finished sketches. Even before her palette was set, she laid out her colors: ochre yellow, dusty blue, earth red. Each cap unscrewed, each tube pressed with patient slowness. Paint smeared her fingertips, staining the edges of her nails. The weight of her gaze fixed on nothing but the canvas waiting in the dim blue sun. These mornings the house was still, the courtyard doves not yet rustling, the rest of the world still tucked away. Papers lay quiet under the glass. Every small sound, the slight scrape of a brush against the glass jar's rim, the faint click as she set down her palette knife, seemed louder, solemn in the silence. She took a deep breath, her chest pressed lightly by the straps of her braces, and let it out slowly, settling the air inside and around her. As she prepared, Frida's mind drifted not to finished paintings, not to the day's tasks, but to the quality of this exact light, this precise ache that traveled from spine to fingertip. She was not creating for applause or posterity, but from the inward rhythm of need. Some might call it genius. For her, it was more like compulsion, a sacred restlessness, as involuntary as breath. She would sit, waiting in stillness between each brushstroke, letting a memory slip across the mirror's glass. The painting would begin not from vision, but from the deep still well of attention, the kind of focus that draws the whole world inside a single room. In the blue morning, before anyone else woke, the half-light drifted across the old wooden floorboards inside La Casa Azul. Frida's cane rested nearby, a silent witness to her slow, determined path from the bed to her kitchen. Her hands brushed the textured surface of the table, cool from the night. There was calm in these routines, opening a tin of earthy herbs, measuring loose leaves into her smallest clay pot. Every morning this was her altar, fingers steady, movements practiced. The kettle's breath melted into the hush. Steam floated upward, carrying the memory of sun-warmed fields far beyond the city. Nothing rushed. Each act began as devotion, an ordinary day's repetition transforming into something quietly urgent within her. There was always pain, a low current, winding through bone and deep tissue. But work, the ritual of making, the setting of cloth, the painting of her brow, pulled a different current awake. Genius in that pale room was not drama, but discipline. It was putting on the huiple, the pleated skirts, each layer against her skin, anchoring her to the present moment. The mirror in her room reflected nothing theatrical, just self-recognition, patient and almost defiant. There is the taste of tea on her tongue and the soft pressure of a wooden bead in her hand, slow, sure proof that she existed here before the world expected anything at all. On the tiled windowsill, sunlight peeled away shadows. She looked at her plants, the spines of succulents and the loose arms of ferns spilling from ceramic pots, each leaf a story of resilience. To tend them required consistency, and in that practice she met herself. Tiny acts, repeated daily, carried meaning deeper than inspiration. She watered with intention, careful not to let the soil dry, soothed by the simple giving and receiving. The room filled with a soft hum, brushes soaking, linen skirts whispering over stone. Here an energy gathered, not frenzied but focused, as if drawn up from a deep well. The day had not yet begun to demand itself. There was only the next motion, the next breath, the next fold in the coat, the next careful step with the cane. Genius grew most quietly in this attention to the ritual, to discipline wrapped in affection for the moment. In these slow hours, work did not consume, it clarified, not an escape but a return. Her tools were simple, brush, pigment, fabric. The flow she entered was not ecstatic, but elemental. Like water passing over stone, each repetition shaped her inner world. There were no wasted movements, no grand gestures to witness. Only a current rising, steady, almost sacred, as she pressed herself again into the work that steadied her life. It was not obsession in the way people imagined. The sacred current ran deeper, beneath talk of madness or genius. Each morning, through deliberate effort, something subtle awakened. Not the fire of creation, but the slow kindling, the light that comes from showing up day after day for the tasks that tether the soul to the earth. Frida breathed in, slow and conscious, the room holding her like water holds a stone. In the gentle half-light of her room, Frida would hold porcelain cups with both hands. The tea was never rushed. It steamed quietly, sending ribbons of warmth into the morning air, warming the ache that hummed quietly beneath her ribs. Her fingers, small and marked with paint, were also marred by hospital bracelets and the impressions left behind by linen bandages. Cooling tea would sometimes reflect the sky in its surface, and on certain days she would just sit there, gazing into the cup as if searching for something she remembered losing. A pair of sandals lay beside her bed, always within reach, but not always worn. She liked the feel of tiled floors against her feet, even when her body resisted. Sometimes she pressed her soles flat to the cool tiles, letting the chill root her back into the world. She moved slowly, and sometimes she didn't move at all. Doctors' notes and worn paper reports gathered on a chair, quiet reminders of what was taken from her, of how her body had to surrender over and over again. Dreams of children, hopes carefully gathered, then lost. More than once, she would let her hand rest on her stomach, feeling the absence. Letters from friends arrived in stacks, their familiar handwriting offering solace and company. Sometimes she would read them aloud, the paper soft yet slightly stiff from handling. These letters told her she was loved, but didn't always reach the most silent places inside her chest, where grief settled quietly. Beneath the surface of her boldness there had been betrayals, too, love rearranged but not erased. She kept some photographs face down on the table, unable to look. Sometimes she would lift one, trace its outline, and then slide it under a book, returning it to sleep alongside the others. As the light shifted through the window, Frida would find herself in hospital linens once more, the faint rustle of starched cotton pulling her back to too many rooms with high white ceilings. the clatter of metal carts, and the sterile scent of antiseptic. Her body bore witness to these memories, long scars, gentle bruises, and the ache in her spine that never fully faded. She would close her eyes and listen to the quiet hum of the household, allowing small sounds, a bird outside, the rattle of a distant tray, to soften the sharpness of her recollections. Even in her independence, in the way she dressed each morning with deliberate care, there was a longing for something that could not return. The silk ribbons and embroidered blouses provided the world with color, but inside, Frida was always negotiating what she had lost. She learned to sit with absence, to place it alongside the brush, the brew, the sunlight sneaking onto her skin without asking. Her strength was real, but so was the morning woven through each morning, quiet but never fully gone. Beneath her confident movements, the secret was always there. She was the sum of what remained and what was missing, holding both with the same tenderness that she used to pour her tea, trace her scars, or lift a letter from its envelope. The air in La Casa Azul carried these histories, barely shifting the curtains, letting her remember without being forced to relive. There were mornings when Frida's hands lingered above her own lap, still and suspended, before the day asked her to move. In these moments, when silence pressed close inside La Casa Azul, she let herself feel the emptying that had come with so many yesterdays. Loss was not a stranger here. It had seeped into the grain of old wooden doorways, humming faintly beneath every tile. This was a house that had learned the sound of letting go. The morning air carried the scent of lime leaves and faint smoke drifting from the kitchen. She inhaled, then exhaled, slowly. Each breath seemed to echo through the chambers of the blue house, widening a subtle hollow within. This emptiness was not absence, it was the gentle release of what could not be kept. Frida had learned, over time, that to surrender isn't just to forfeit, but to make space. Like the blue walls themselves, once painted over old sorrows, she allowed space for the quiet to hold her. There were the crutches leaning against her bed, wood smooth from years of touch. Some mornings she gazed at them, neither resisting nor clinging. The pain that washed through her body was constant, a slow tide, ebbing, returning. She did not hide from it, nor did she invite it. Instead, she met it. Just as the day would eventually meet the sun's warmth, she acknowledged the ache, letting it ripple through her without defense. In this act of acceptance, she found a delicate grace. To lose, she realized, was sometimes to become lighter, even as the bones felt heavy. Sunlight crept along the tile floors, tracing the edges of her dressing table. Perfume bottles and combs stacked themselves with quiet order. She reached for a thin chain, silver, cool from night air, lifting it with tender fingers. Jewelry, a gift from a friend long gone, had become a small reliquary of memory. In the mirror, her own reflection seemed softened by the dawn, blurred at the edges. Loss returned here too, not as a wound alone, but as a channel through which light spread. The mirror did not show what had vanished, only what remained, suffused with its quiet blessing. It took time to accept this kind of emptiness, to stop resisting the places inside her that could not be filled, only held. A cup of tea cooled beside her paint brushes, steam rising in gentle ribbons. She did not rush to drink. Sitting quietly, she watched the surface tremble, noticing the space inside the cup was as essential as the tea itself. There is a peace that arrives only when we surrender to the hollowness, allowing it to become the meeting point for mercy. Frida let herself empty into the morning, not because she had chosen to lose, but because she trusted that being hallowed was not an ending. In this rhythm of letting go, the world quieted. There was grace somehow in not grasping for what had faded or fractured. The blue house, her shelter and witness, held the impression of everything that had been surrendered. Inside its quiet rooms, Frida moved like water, reshaped, yet still whole. Loss was not final. It became a cradle where gentleness could gather, where grace waited in the space between what was and what would never be again. And slowly, she learned to rest inside that space, empty but blessed, surrendered but entirely alive. There are mornings now when the sun waits at the farthest window, spilling its first thin rays across the old tiles of La Casa Azul. Frida stirs, noticing how quiet everything has become. Her hand, steady yet a little slower, rests for a while on the blue blanket pulled up around her waist. There is no rush in this moment, only the gentle creak of the house breathing, and the coarse weave of linen beneath her palm grown softer through years of touch. A cup sits on the bedside table, already warm with the steeping scent of chamomile. It's the same mug she's held since the early days, but now the ritual is more drawn out. Lifting it, she feels the warmth seep into her fingers, a small relief for joints that ache a bit more each season. The steam meanders upward, clouding the rim soft, unfocused, like a sense of time on these mornings. Sipping slowly, she lets the stillness fill her chest, noticing the faint click of the ceramic against her teeth. Her hair, once braided tight and adorned boldly each morning, waits quietly under a scarf. She pauses at the mirror by her bedside, not to arrange flowers or smooth stray wisps, but simply to observe. The glass is cool to the touch, always slightly fogged at the edges. She studies the familiar lines on her brow, each one, she thinks, a memory etched in patience. There is no urge to hurry past this reflection. The world outside La Casa Azul stays silent a little longer. The morning light touches everything deliberately, her handmade shawl folded neatly at the foot of the bed, a stack of unopened letters waiting in a clay bowl. She lets her gaze stay on the letters, their edges soft, the handwriting familiar and looping. She doesn't reach for them, not yet. There is a rhythm to waiting, a kind of peace in letting things remain untouched until the right moment. The embroidered pillow beneath her shifts as she leans back, exhaling slow and deep. Outside her window, there is the faint hum of distant life, a dog barking, a vendor's cart rolling along the street, the plaintive calls blending softly into the soundscape of morning. Frida listens with her whole body, her breath slowing to meet the hush of the house. It's in these later mornings that she notices stillness outlasting urgency. Time does not tug at her sleeves or urge her to the easel. Instead, she lets herself remain here, in the bed, in the blue-washed quiet, without the need to produce anything. She is not less herself in these moments. If anything, she feels more returned, as if the years have shaped her not into someone new, but deeper into herself. As shadows shift across the floor, Frida thinks of the softness that comes with letting go of expectation. Her body, though marked by pain, gives way to a slower rhythm. The tea cools in her hand, and the morning stretches, sacred and unhurried. There is nothing to do but be, and so she lingers, honoring the patient grace that age brings, grateful that solitude remains her oldest, closest companion. And the world beyond the cobalt walls waits quietly until she is ready to rise. With age, Frida's mornings became both quieter and more certain. She moved with intention, each step deliberate on the familiar clay tiles, the soft click of her wooden cane echoing through the blue corridors. Once she might have hurried to meet the world. Now the weight of her years let her linger in the slow act of being. She sat by her mirror beneath the high ceiling, letting daylight settle over her scars and the fine lines at her mouth. The rush was gone. The expectation of urgency had faded. She gazed into her reflection, allowing the world to soften at the edges. There was no need to hide. The story written on her face needed no translation. Her aged hands, wrapped in embroidered linen, cupped the warmth of a clay mug. The tea within was simple: lemon, chamomile, maybe a little honey. It was enough. Each sip was taken without distraction, her breath rising and falling at a safe, measured pace. There was no calendar pressing, only the hush of morning light folding through the curtains. Sometimes she touched the necklace at her throat, feeling each bead as a memory. There was nowhere else to be. This moment in age was revealed as a return, not a losing, but an arrival. The world had always wanted something from her, but these mornings she gave herself back. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she could remember the scent of paint, the warmth of Diego's coat left on a chair, the voices and humming in the courtyard. None of it demanded anything. She let things arrive and let them leave. A vase of dahlias might begin to wilt in a corner, but there was no harshness in its decline. There was simply another shape, another color on the journey of existence. In these years, Frida didn't turn away from loss or pain. She rested beside it like an old friend. There was still ache in her back and legs, still days when the body grew slow or unmovable. She didn't fight it any more. The doctor's letters, the bottles lined against a wooden shelf, were present, but not defining. Acceptance settled in with the blue morning shadows. To be authentic was to let herself be as she truly was, not always strong, not always visionary, just present, in tune with each detail. The soft creak of a floorboard, the quiet stirring of the courtyard trees. There was a small sense of freedom in this stage. The years had left her tender to the texture of the table, the smoothness of a painted bowl, the sound of slippers on stone. Her age granted her the permission to stop pleasing, performing, or correcting the world's idea of her. In the privacy of her room, she allowed silence to answer most of the questions. This, she realized, was the gift of living long enough to return every morning to herself. No script to follow, only the slow, open honesty of simply being and being enough. A faint shaft of light, barely touched by the blue of morning, rests against the faded covers of Frida's bed. Even before consciousness settles, there is a quiet expectancy in the room: papers, always nearby on her nightstand, corners curled in the slow humidity of night, holding the memory of dreams not yet lost to waking. Her fingers, still heavy with sleep, reach across the linen, brushing edges of a worn notebook. Some mornings, the weight of dreams lingers longer, images pressing at the edge of awareness, asking not to be forgotten. With slow care, she opens to a blank page, pen hovering. She pauses, noticing a tiny scuff on the wood of her nightstand, the particularity of this moment anchoring her back into her own body. The house is still, only the muted sound of distant birds and the quiet pulse of her breath filling the blue-tinged space. Here, in this liminal hour, the separation between sleep and waking feels soft, like a fine muslin curtain billowing in a faint breeze. Sometimes her entries are a cascade of images: a deer with a woman's face, a clock melting into a tree trunk, a hand holding a wounded heart. She lets her pen follow the shapes behind her eyelids, not forcing sense, letting images rise where they may. She does not search for answers, only records what the night has given. Morning tea waits, but there is no hurry. The warm glazed ceramic of her cup sits untouched, a gentle reminder of ritual, but her attention belongs, for now, to the lingering shapes of sleep. As she sketches, the paper carries the slight drag of graphite, occasionally smudged by her palm. The desk beneath is cool and unyielding, grounding her in the present even as her mind returns to the world behind her eyelids. Here, the pain in her body is quieted, held at bay by the reverence of the task. In these pages, Frida allows herself contradictions, wounds that blossom into flowers, ancestral eyes peering from shadows, limbs entwined with roots. The air, faintly scented with jasmine trailing in from the courtyard, reminds her that night and day are not enemies. Through all of this, the sketches remain private companions. There is no need to interpret or polish. It's enough to listen and transcribe. Sometimes she retraces symbols that have appeared before, a sun close to the heart, braided hair tangled with serpents, a face split by both joy and ache. These forms recur and change, suggesting both suffering and sanctuary, until the paper feels as familiar as skin. She is not alone in these blue hours. Feathers left on her pillow, echoes of stories her mother told, all the landscapes of her dreams blend softly with her earliest memories. And so she lets herself linger in that gentle space between waking and sleep, not rushing to resolve the images, but trusting that each carries its own small truth. In this pre-dawn quiet, nothing needs to be finished. The house, the air, her body, everything can be both wounded and whole, just one slow breath at a time. The carton sheets are softly wrinkled, edges gathered in the faint impression of sleep. Frida lies still between waking and dreaming, sunlight uncertain at the doorway. The air is velvet here, heavy with the warmth of her breath and the shade of cobalt walls. In this in-between, the weight of yesterday and tomorrow is set down, even for a short while. At her bedside, the little wooden table holds a glass of water. Its coolness against her palm is an anchor before letting go. The glass sweats, leaving a neat ring on worn wood, a quiet mark of the body's presence, proof that this morning is real. Here, with eyelids closed, Frida's spirit drifts beyond the brokenness of her bones. There is pain there, always pain, but in these moments the body seems only a gentle frame, as if it was always meant for holding the soul's bigger dreams. The border between what was suffered and what could become softens under the hush of drifting thought. In the final months, the mornings in La Casa Azul arrived gently, like old companions. The wide wooden doors let in a flat, pale light, no longer the sharp, wild blue that once covered the courtyard, but something softer, diffused through curtains no one opened all the way any more. Frida's bed sat beneath her mirror, carved and marked, surrounded by objects she kept close. A glass of water, a small portrait, a handful of dried marigold petals in a saucer. The hum of the city barely reached these walls, though sometimes a truck would rattle by on London Street, trembling the panes. Pain made itself known before anything else, a deep throb, constant, unfurling beneath the ribs and in each fragile joint. She woke slowly, sometimes not at all until late morning, breathing shallow, waiting for distance from the ache to grow. A nurse moved quietly across the yellow-tiled floor, her shoes whispering, helping Frida sit up as best she could. There were syringes, towels, the weight of medicine in a chipped ceramic cup. These small rituals, unchanged, became her armor. The brushing of hair, the tying of ribbons, hands lingering at the seams of her embroidered dress, sleeves arranged to protect tender arms. In these days, Frida's wheelchair, black, sturdy, rimmed with metal, rested near the foot of her bed. Morning after morning, she would slide into its seat, using her thin, careful hands for balance. Her palms pressed to the leather, feeling its warmth from sun and skin. There was often silence in these hours. Sometimes Diego's voice called gently from the kitchen, or a friend lingered in the hallway, but more often it was just the ticking of the clock mounted above the turquoise door. The scent of boiled coffee drifted in, mingling with faint eucalyptus from the garden beyond, her world measured by the distance from bed to easel, as the windows stayed mostly closed against the world. Pain was not just a visitor, but a constant presence now. Some mornings, Frida looked down and watched her hands trembling, the knuckles swollen and pale. The world had narrowed. Painting now required assistance. A friend would help mix colors, lift a canvas, place a brush between her fingers. Still, she insisted on this ritual. The canvas was like a blank sheet laid across her lap, and her eyes, sharp behind thick glasses, traveled across its white surface as if searching for an answer. Each movement was deliberate. The brush touched the oil with a familiar, slow certainty, and she began. Color was still hers, even as the body failed. Ochre, cobalt, emerald, applied with care. There was always a kind of hush, no rush, no energy wasted, simply the act itself, returning again and again to the motion that steadied her spirit. The world inside the house became smaller. Friends and family gathered quietly, their voices muffled behind heavy walls. Sometimes her sister pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. Sometimes older friends sat beside her in silence. There were still letters, sometimes, their envelopes left unopened for days atop the small desk near the bed. She would gather them in the afternoons, tracing fingertips over the rough paper, reading slowly, letting words tumble and settle inside. In these moments, she searched for herself in others' eyes, finding both warmth and fatigue. Objects became her companions, a bottle of favorite perfume, a pair of earrings shaped like hands, a crumpled photograph.